I'm glad to introduce Dr. Jerusha Detweiler-Bedell, who is here to tell us about her career path for SSCP's How Did I Get Here video series. Dr. Detweiler-Bedell received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology from Yale University in 2001. At that time, she joined the psychology faculty at Lewis and Clark College, where she is currently professor as well as interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. Her work focuses on the role of message framing in promoting beneficial physical and mental health behaviors. Dr. Detweiler-Bedell, please describe your career path and tell us about any obstacles or barriers that you overcame along the way. In addition, tell us what has surprised you about your job and what you wish you had known earlier about this type of position.
Thank you, and hello. So I think to capture my career path, I have to start more at the beginning, which is my undergraduate days. And I was an undergraduate at Stanford University. And at the time, majoring in psychology, let alone having a profession in the discipline, was not something that I had considered. I thought first that I was going to be perhaps a journalist, and then I thought maybe international relations. And as I took courses in those areas, I found that there was one common theme that interested me, and that was the people that I was studying and the people who were influenced in these fields, and less so, for example, the politics or economics associated with international relations. So as an undergraduate, it wasn't until my sophomore year that I sat in my first psychology class, and actually it was classes. I was fortunate enough to be able to co-enroll. I had one introduction to psychology class and at the same time abnormal psychology. And my abnormal psychology class was taught by Professor Susan Nolan-Huxema, who was a tremendous influence on my life and my life's direction as it turned out, although I didn't know it at first. And my intro to psych class was taught by Phil Zimbardo. So I had these very influential mentors to be, and yet at the time when I was in the classroom, I didn't even recognize that this was going to be my major. But not long into my sophomore year, I was hooked through Intro to Psych. I was really hooked on the idea of what it means to be a professor, to really engage with your students as both an audience, but also as a group of people with very unique and exciting ideas that you could engage with as a professor. Because for those of you, if you haven't watched Discovering Psychology or met Phil Zimbardo in person, you certainly can imagine, though, his energy and charisma, and that really influenced me. And then through my work with Susan Nolan-Huxema, she was the first faculty member to reach out to an undergraduate audience, because this was a relatively large abnormal psychology class, and say who would be interested in learning about the research process in clinical psychology. And so I got to volunteer as an undergraduate with her, doing research on women who, I believe it was mothers who were depressed, but it was looking at women who with depression and how they were coping, and it involved going on visits to people's homes and doing some interviews. And that was very transformative for me. So really from that moment on, from those two classrooms, I feel that my career path was launched, not in a way that I imagined when I was younger, but certainly for the rest of my undergraduate time, I was really focused on the idea of what does it mean to be a psychologist and what am I interested in? So there was a neat opportunity that I had as an undergrad, which was in my senior year. I was able to be part of what's called a co-terminal master's program. So I was able to start doing graduate work at the same time that I was finishing my BA, and did, instead of an honors thesis, it was a master's project, but pretty similar, designing an experiment and seeing what happened. And I got the bug, the research bug. But at the same time, I was really struck by the fact that the students who were graduate students in my class looked so tired and so exhausted. And it led me to question, is this the path that I want? And I had to think about that. And in fact, one of my undergrad mentors said, graduate school sucks the life out of you. If you're going to be a graduate student, be really careful to keep that life within you. And so that's something that definitely shaped my thinking. And in part because of the various professors that I had as an undergraduate, I was not sure what type of doctoral program I was going to thrive the most in. So I actually applied to an equal number of social psychology doctoral programs and clinical psychology programs. And the clinical psychology doctoral programs were of particular interest to me, in part because I felt they would give me flexibility in my career. And I definitely acknowledged, to myself at that time, that teaching was something of great interest to me. So too was my enthusiasm for research. But the idea of figuring out what it means to potentially have a clinical practice, to have other options if the academic job market didn't work out, these seemed to be important for me to take into mind. So as it turned out, I ended up going on a path towards a doctoral program in clinical psychology, and yet my mentor is a social psychologist. So a little bit of the best of all worlds. So that was at Yale, and Peter Salovey was my graduate school doctoral thesis advisor. Although at the time, the way the program worked, I was able to explore a lot of different interest areas. And I would say that the common theme that's driven my interest in research, beginning for sure in graduate school, but even if I look back, there were hints of it as an undergrad, was the way in which people can be highly aware of and acknowledge they have a deep appreciation for what would be good for themselves or others, but still they encounter barriers to doing those good things. So in some of my earlier work as a graduate student, I looked at health message framing. So how do you persuade people to do the things they know are good for them? And then my more independent work came out of that was looking at how you do that with clinical populations or with individuals who had clinical symptoms. So for example, people who are experiencing symptoms of depression, what can you do to help them overcome some of those barriers or better motivate themselves to seek help, to activate their behavior, engage in pleasant activities, and so forth. And so it was during these very formative years of graduate school that I began to first figure out what it meant to really be a clinical psychologist and a clinical researcher. At the same time, to be mentored by someone who had a social psychology background, though working in a clinical psychology faculty program, and to begin to sort out what really were my primary aspirations in my career trajectory. And one of the pieces that I was going to address, or that you asked me to address, was the idea of obstacles. And one of the obstacles I believe that I faced was coming to terms with and sharing with my mentor the fact that I didn't want to do exactly the same thing that he was doing. As much as I respected and loved working with and being mentored by him, what I saw was him having to juggle extremely large multi-million-dollar grants with the hiring and supporting of postdocs and of graduate students, of course, and then undergrads working with the graduate students. And I found that I couldn't quite imagine myself doing that as my career. And how do you say that to someone who you respect so deeply and you care so much about what they think of you, but also what, you want them to know how much you respect them. So I still can remember as if it were yesterday, the moment that I walked into Professor Salovey's office and I sat down and I said to him, I think I want to be at a liberal arts college for my profession. If I want to be a professor, that's the type of job I would like. And he first asked me, are you sure it's because you want to do this and not because you think you cannot do an R1? And I said, no, I think I really want to do this. And I was anxious and I remember my heart racing, and he just smiled and said, well, I'll support you in every way. We'll figure out a way to support you in doing that. And so having that incredibly generous, kind, warm, supportive response was very important. Turns out it was more of a psychological obstacle on my part and less of a real obstacle, in the sense that I just needed to talk with him about what really mattered to me. But at the same time, during that phase of my graduate training, so I had begun to come to terms with the fact that that there were multiple interests that I was juggling. I really did love teaching, and the experiences in getting opportunities, I guess I should say, in actually teaching were far and few between. Teaching assistantship, yes. Teaching actual classes, not so available. So I really had to look for opportunities to do that, which included teaching in the summer, which was a real formative experience, the first time to go through a syllabus independently, creation of a syllabus independently. And I actually co-taught that class with another graduate student. I also found, and this was now a number of years ago, but there was a pilot project on online courses, and so participated in that. So there was a lot of effort and energy that had to be put behind trying to find teaching opportunities at that time. But as I did it, I really was able to identify how meaningful and how rewarding that work was. Now, the clinical training aspect I didn't touch on. So Peter Salve, my advisor, was mentoring me in my research, and of course I was taking classes. But then I was being mentored in my clinical interests by a variety of faculty. And the way that the system worked when I was a graduate student is we had different rotations each year, and you could choose to stay at the same rotation, but I chose to explore a wide array. And so in my first year of graduate school, it was actually mostly around assessment and learning how to do diagnostic interviews, intake interviews, and that was common across my peers. In my second year of graduate school, I worked with children with conduct problems. And for a while, I thought, this is going to be my clinical home. This is the piece that most inspires me, working with kids. But I found that no matter what I did in the clinical office with the kids I was working with, what seemed to stand out to me much more was what was happening in the waiting room, the way that the parents were interacting with their kids. And of course, ideal treatments involve the family as well as the individual children. But at the time, it was a real epiphany for me to say, you know what, maybe it isn't kids where I want to put my efforts as a clinician. And instead, I want to learn better how to work with adults. So I then did a rotation, worked with individuals having depression, which ended up being a place that I came back to in terms of my clinical work later on in my career. Also an eating disorders rotation, and then finally in my last year worked on with anxiety disorders, especially panic disorder. And in having each of those experiences, each was an important learning experience as I also envisioned what my future life would look like. So what could I imagine doing if I were going to have a clinical practice? What kind of treatment did I feel most efficacious at providing? Did I feel that balance that was right for me in terms of looking at the impact of research on the way that the practice of the clinical work was done? And so ultimately, I became really most interested in working with individuals who had depression or anxiety disorders. So when I applied then for my clinical internship, the thought was, okay, if I want to have the option of a clinical practice, but the aspiration to be a liberal arts professor, what type of internship site might really help me fulfill those goals? And although the temptation was to go to to prioritize an internship site where I would be doing a lot of research, I decided instead to prioritize one where I could have a type of clinical experience that I hadn't had as a graduate student. And I think that was really important, something that I wasn't as, perhaps, hindsight makes it seem much more intentional than it was. So right now I can say that was a really good choice. At the time, it didn't quite feel so intentional. And so I ended up doing my clinical internship at McLean Hospital, where I was working with much more severe psychopathology, experiencing what it's like to work with individuals having schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and personality disorder diagnoses, which again was something that I had not had any opportunity to work with as a graduate student. And little did I know at that time that this was probably one of the most transformative experiences in terms of my teaching. Not my clinical practice, but my ability later in life to be, I think, a much more skilled instructor of abnormal and clinical psychology. So that piece of, treating the psychology internship as an opportunity to round out for me what I had gotten as a graduate student was really important. Of course, that doesn't apply for everyone, but for me, that was really important. There was another obstacle that I wanted to mention that was something that I didn't think of as an obstacle, but more so as a challenge, and that was being part of an academic couple. So there, more and more, for years, obviously, people try to determine what they do when they and their partner are both trying to look for academic jobs. And so my husband, Brian Detweiler-Bedell, at the time was a social psychology graduate student in the same program. And we got to know each other because we both were in the same research lab. And in fact, Peter Salve later went on to call himself our full purpose advisor because he conducted our wedding ceremony. So Anyway, the challenge there too was figuring out how to navigate and negotiate two careers. And I know that people make a variety of very difficult choices in order to make that happen. We had known mentors who had bi-coastal relationships, meaning one person was on the East Coast, the other was on the West Coast, and the challenges associated with that were many, and yet you have to respect each person's relationship and what they're making for their decisions. For us personally, we knew we didn't want to have that type of living far away from each other. We wanted to be in a situation where we could be commuting distance from one another. And so as a result, we prioritized, when we were on the job market for academic jobs, positions where at least there was some other job in the vicinity. And as it turned out, we mostly were applying just to the East Coast and the West Coast to various schools. And truthfully, this is another moment that stands out to me, which is when my supervisor on my clinical internship held up the Chronicle. There was some advertisement. It was a newspaper that was advertising the jobs in psychology. And of course, nothing was online, or very little was online at that time. And he pointed and he said, "I found your job and I found Brian's." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, "Have you heard of Lewis and Clark College?" And I said, "No, I haven't." He said, "It's in Oregon." Okay, I think I've driven through Oregon once. It's in Portland. Oh, well, I hear that Portland's a great city. And sure enough, pure good fortune, good luck. They were looking for a social psychologist who was a statistician and a clinical psychologist who could teach health psychology. And it was an amazing twist of fate that those two jobs were available at the same time. But we applied and were fortunate enough to be selected into those positions. So what I will say about academic couples is that although we ended up being fortunate to get those jobs together, out of the many other places we applied, there was no other location in which we both were offered jobs. And we know that there's a lot of patience that comes from being an academic couple, but I can say at this point in my career, seeing enough academic couples, I've found that many, if not most or even all that I can think of right now, have managed to figure out a way for them both to have fulfilling careers. But during that time, before I knew that Lewis and Clark would end up being a place that worked for both of us, I did feel really very reassured that I was having the clinical training that I needed in order to be flexible. If my husband got an academic job that was a perfect fit, I felt that I could pursue the clinical work as my focus in my career. And for him, he felt that he could do statistical consulting if I ended up getting the academic job. So another piece of how the clinical PhD was important to me, and something that I brought along with me as I was trying to figure out my permanent home. So then once getting to Lewis and Clark, I think the transition became one of figuring out what it means to be a true teacher scholar. And the typical day in my life as a faculty member at Lewis and Clark is one with a very open door type of approach to undergraduate education, both in terms of the classroom, having very collaborative, smaller classes, really getting to know your students, knowing their interests within the classroom as well as outside of the classroom. But also the part that I really have come to love dearly about teaching at a place like this is the way that undergraduates are crucial in terms of being my collaborators in the research itself. And this was something where both Brian and I were coming from Yale and saw the model of the big research lab, as I described, and how you, as a person working at an R1, have this opportunity to have a laddered approach to doing your research, laddered responsibilities. So, your postdocs are maybe running the day-to-day operations. The graduate students are applying their ideas, and they're helping the undergraduates be research assistants. And so the challenge that we were grappling with is, how do you translate that R1 model, the good parts of it, the exciting parts of it, into a small college environment where our undergraduate student body is 2,000 total. And even though psychology is the most popular major on the campus, even still, you're looking at a much smaller pool, and you're certainly not looking at having graduate students or postdocs in the typical person's lab. So what we ended up really focusing on in trying to create, and has become a really important part of my own experiences and career, is a lab that is trying to mimic some of the good parts of that big lab environment of my graduate training. So what we have is a group of, it's a collaborative model. So you have a student who is more advanced in the major, most often a senior, who's the team leader, the person who is taking the lead on the research project in close collaboration with me or with Brian, since we do have a large group lab. And then that person is mentoring a younger student, a student who's probably has declared psychology, has taken statistics, but isn't yet far enough along to really know research methods from their coursework, but is someone who's on that path towards psychology. And then the third member of these research teams is a new student who's new to the college, maybe even new to psychology, but has that energy and curiosity and dedication that they are willing to try to engage with these challenging research questions. And so the teams typically are of three, so a team leader, an associate, and a student who's new, so a team assistant, work together collaboratively with each other as well as with their faculty mentor, with me or with Brian. And as we've developed this system, it has become so rewarding because what you have is students who stay with the lab, maybe with the lab for 3 full years of their time. And so by the time that they're in the senior year, and some actually have come even since freshman year, they're really expert not only in the line of research that they're exploring with me, but also in how to interact with and train their fellow students in what it means to be a psychology researcher. And this is interesting because, I mean, this has been interesting to me not only because it's helped to further my original interest in research that I described earlier, but also because it's become a line of scholarly inquiry in and of itself. That is, how do you enhance the sense of collaboration? How do you create real, positive, productive teamwork among a group? How do you mentor well? What are some of the most effective pedagogical strategies that mentor students, bringing them from novices to true experts in what they're doing, and all as undergraduates? So this has been a really exciting part of my career that I could not have predicted back when I was a graduate student, let alone before that, but has been some of the true reward. And now that I'm in my 14th year at Lewis and Clark, it's been wonderful to have this whole group now of alumni who are off doing extraordinary things, some of whom are faculty. We're very proud of them, but we're equally proud of the students who've gone on to be whether they be statisticians or teachers or researchers, or actually one of our students most recently was a docent in a national park in Hawaii, but she used her research skills to be able to, for the first time, formulate excellent understanding and instructions around what people were seeing when they were visiting this national park. So all of these different paths in seeing this enacted by our students has been really exciting. But another piece that you asked me to talk about was surprises. And I think the biggest surprise is my current position. And that is, I'm currently interim dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. And I can honestly say that even the other things that I mentioned that were surprising does not compare to the fact that I did not envision myself as an administrator. And it's really interesting. I mean, I feel in how I ended up in this position, it was not one where I was deliberately collecting experiences or trying to figure out what I needed to be in this position. In fact, when I was asked by the president to take on this role last summer or last spring, after our former dean got hired as a president of another college, my first thought was, wait, me? Is this really, you're asking me to do this? It wasn't something I anticipated. I think the reason though, and this is something to be aware of at a liberal arts college, but I think it's true of other institutions as well, is that sometimes you find your career pulls you into a lot of committee-based work. And as I spent time at Lewis and Clark, I found myself serving on standing committees like the Committee on Admissions and Financial Aid, and more recently, the Committee on the Curriculum, which in essence is responsible for the entire curriculum of the institution, ranging from the general education all our students have to take some of through to majors and the content of those majors and minors. And although I never intended to be an administrator, I had some, I guess, natural, so to speak, or trained abilities that translated well. And so that's what stood out and I think made me the person that they asked to take on this role for this interim year. And what has surprised me is that I would say approximately 80% of my time as dean is overlapping with the skills I use in clinical psychology. I think my clinical training has been guiding me in my efforts in this administrative position in a way that I never would have imagined. And yet, now that I'm in it, it seems so obvious. A lot of what an administrator, especially a dean role, does is help to navigate difficult situations, whether you're helping someone achieve their goals, helping someone accept that their aspirations or goals are not achievable right now and to make sense of that and figure out how to move on, helping people prioritize, helping people work more effectively together in groups, or just the simple act of, helping transition people into a new experience or to accept changes, because change, as we know, is very difficult to accept. So all of that, again, a lot of hindsight here, but my clinical training has filtered directly into, I think, some of the reasons why I've had a good experience, a very rewarding experience as interim dean. And I think that another piece that I would say, in terms of what I had known earlier, is their advice or things that I would known earlier, I think that I discovered along the way that figuring out your work and life, personal life balance is something that truly does take time and some trial and error. But what I found is that if you can prioritize and put boundaries around certain pieces of your life, it's okay, first of all. And second of all, you will get done a good amount of what you need to do. So even as dean right now, I'm still able to spend time with my family. I have 3 young children and with Brian, and still be able to have time together. Would have thought that was impossible if someone had told me I'd have to step into dean with a 5-year-old, 7-year-old, and 11-year-old. But I have been able to. And before that, when I had more time for research, I'm not as productive with that right now as dean. But when I had up until this time, what I found was really important was to, in addition to prioritizing my home life, was to prioritize my research, scholarship-related goals, and especially writing. Writing is something that is often so difficult to find time for. At any institution, I'm sure that's the case. At a liberal arts college where your door is so often open to your students, your teaching load is quite intensive often, and you're trying to keep your research going. How do you make time to write? And I found that the secret of it for me, which is not my idea, others have written about it and talked about it, is to treat your writing time in the same way as you would an obligation like a class. You would not skip or fail to show up to a class that you are teaching. So similarly, you would not schedule a meeting on top of a class that you're teaching. And so for me, that mental shift where when I scheduled on my calendar time for writing, I treated with the same sort of sacred respect as I did a class that I was teaching, it really did change my level of productivity. So I mentioned committee work and how much that has become a part of many faculty members' minds and lives. I wouldn't say yes to a meeting if it were happening during that time of writing during the week. And even having just a few, a couple of hours, a couple of times a week, that was time that would not have any overlap, was tremendous help for me. So that's another piece of advice. And I think the thinking about the big picture and trajectory from here is something that's very much on my mind. One piece that I am completely committed to still is being a teacher and a researcher who works closely with undergraduates. So even though I am taking this year as interim dean, I've chosen not to continue at this point. Who knows? I've learned you can't predict the future, just like I could never have predicted I would have been interim dean right now. But my intentions coming up are to return to the classroom, return to my research, and continue to foster and develop that. And actually, I'll say one more thing. I've talked about the research lab. I've talked about a bit of my administrative role and the way that my clinical skills have really played a role there. But I feel, interestingly, that I haven't said quite enough about my teaching. And I want to link back to the comment I made about my clinical internship when I was at McLean, working with severe psychopathology, and how that really did shape who I was in the classroom. And it was because when I teach, even now, I draw back to experiences or examples of instances in treating or trying to work with individuals during that time of my life, and even to my graduate school life. And I draw back to that and also make sure I bring people into my classroom who are much more expert in different clinical diagnoses or in different types of treatment. And that has been an important bridge. Building that community and network with other clinical psychologists who come and visit my classes has been really important. And I also recognize now that I haven't talked about whether or not I have a clinical practice. It took me a number of years to accrue enough hours to be license eligible in the state of Oregon, because I was trying to do that on top of prepping all these new classes, starting up a research lab. So I think it took me probably about 6 years to accrue the right amount of hours. And then I studied for the exams and finally got licensed. And interestingly, it was through a guest speaker, someone who I had heard at a continuing education workshop, who I invited to speak with my students, who then heard at the end of the class, "Oh, I understand that you just recently got licensed. Do you have time to take on a few clients? Because I don't have enough time to provide the care I need to my clients." And his specialty was in anxiety disorders. So it ended up providing a little foot in the door to a very small but manageable practice where I would work with predominantly anxiety. So coming back to some of that training that I had done as a graduate student and continued to study up and take continuing education classes on. And so right now, well, I should say as dean, I'm doing nothing new with my clinical practice except maintaining relationships with a couple of clients who I meet with periodically. But up until then, what I found I was able to do is have maybe 2 clients at any given time and spend just a few hours at most each week in clinical practice. And although it's not the main focus of my work by any means, it really is an important part of my career right now. I feel really grounded and connected to the topics that I teach about when I know that I'm also seeing someone and trying to provide some of the treatment to them, and reminding myself of how complex and multifaceted people are, and being able to convey those same messages to my students. And so that piece has also been another really fulfilling part. And just now to get to the place I was starting to wrap up earlier, but as I anticipate the future, I certainly hope to continue to have these experiences both in the classroom and the research lab, as well as to maintain a small clinical practice. I think that if you had to say a theme around my career, it's been the desire for flexibility, so having options that I felt could be flexible enough to respond to my needs in terms of my personal and professional life, but yet finding myself committed time and again to students and to mentoring students, bringing them along on a path that will lead to whatever their future brings, whether it's clinically related or not. And really that brings me full circle to those very early mentors I had. My first professors as an undergraduate who inspired me so, all the many that I won't take time to name now, but the many in between, up through and including my graduate school mentors, of course my advisor, Peter Salovey, but also a number of other really transformative experiences I had working with faculty. So I think it's coming back to that, and to the care that I was given as a student, and to the care that I now want to give to my own students, that really defines my career. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Detweiler-Bedell. We so appreciate your taking the time to talk with us.
My pleasure. Thanks.